Like everyone else, the last few years have been hard. In early 2020, I lost my grandma to pneumonia, and it wouldn't be long before my aunt got sick too and came very close to death herself. It was a lot for a guy my age to handle, but I knew once it was over, I'd be able to see my Faith again. Now, Faith and I had met in middle school and quickly fell in love. Our homes were too far apart to see one another very often. Her parents were also super traditional and didn't want her having a boyfriend. Besides school, our only constant form of contact was the telephone. We'd often talk all night and go straight into school without a second of sleep. And in spite of all the odds, we stayed together. The biggest test of our relationship would be high school. Faith's dad bought a new house even further away. That put Faith into a different school district. Now we would see each other even less. And I was sure this meant the end of our relationship, but Faith refused to give up. By now, we both had computers in our rooms, and we were able to talk and see each other over the internet with webcams. Every day we'd race home from school and talk until early into the next morning. I'd do all my homework during school time so it wouldn't get in the way. Faith did the same, and for the next 3 or so years, this would be our prime avenue of communication. I think we were only able to meet face-to-face a handful of times, and it was hard on both of us. I lost hope more than once, but Faith always lived up to her name and brought me back from the edges of darkness every time. Strangely, despite all the personal sadness that I experienced during the height of the pandemic, Faith and I thrived. Being quarantined worked great for our particular situation. Other than a few hours of school garbage every day, we got to talk uninterrupted all day and night. Even so, not seeing her in person for so long weighed on me. I was doubting our future together, as I had so many times before. Luckily, by then the lockdowns had lifted. Her father would be returning to work, but school remained online. This was the perfect chance for us to be alone together, and I was going to take it. I brought this up with my brother, and he agreed to loan me his car to go see her. A week later, our opportunity arrived. I drove the 35 miles to her house. She rushed me inside and closed the door, and we held one another tightly for a long time. The energy was a bit weird between us, but we overcame it pretty quickly. We rushed off to her room for a little personal time, and I'd forgotten how great being with her was. Unfortunately, our time together was about to be cut short. I had just left her room. Faith was making us a snack when her dad walked in, and he began yelling at me instantly. Things like, "Where is my daughter? What did you do to my little girl?" Faith ran into the room and tried to calm him down, and it didn't help. In his defense, he'd never actually met me. Crazy, I know, considering we'd been together for so long, but our relationship hadn't exactly been normal. We tried to explain the situation, but her dad was just too angry to listen. He looked at Faith and I real closely and sneered, and this would be the point when everything came off the rails. "What have you two been up to?" His expression was so terrifying I didn't dare speak, and he looked back and forth at each of us, but we stayed quiet. "Answer me now. Did you put hands on my little girl?" I remember him saying. Now Faith's dad looked at her and asked her if I'd forced myself on her, and she, acting instinctively, blurted out, "No." We loved each other, and we'd been together since 7th grade. He knew what that meant, and I knew exactly what his expression meant. He gritted his teeth and lunged at me, and he was too fast for me. I was overwhelmed by his size and power, and he grabbed me around the throat with one hand and lifted me off the ground. I was barely able to breathe or swallow. I tried to speak, but he told me to shut up and listen. "I don't care if you two met in kindergarten. You're gonna leave here this second and never contact my little girl again. If I ever see you here again, I won't hesitate to kill you." And with that, he let me drop to the floor and shouted at the top of his lungs to get out. He didn't have to repeat himself. I was already out the door before he finished yelling. I started the car and sped away. I was already several miles down the road before I slowed down. I was shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the wheel. The notifications were going off on my phone, but I didn't care. Odds were high that it was Faith, and I was way too shaken to talk to anyone, especially her. Now back at home, I locked myself in my room and tried to calm down. A few hours passed before I got the courage to check my phone, and just as I suspected, Faith had texted and called me at least 5 times since I'd left. I wasn't sure what to do. I talked to my brother about it, and he suggested that I sleep on it before deciding. It was hard, but I did get to sleep at around 3 a.m. When I awoke the next morning, my mind wasn't any clearer. In fact, now that I had time to rest, I was even more traumatized by what had occurred. I couldn't get Faith's dad's angry face out of my head. I honestly believed that he really would kill me if I gave him the chance. I remain in this cycle of indecision to this day. It's almost been 3 years since I've communicated with Faith, and I'm still unsure if I ever will. She still sends me texts from time to time, and I read them. It's hard to be out of contact after all the years we've been together, but as long as she lives at home, I'm not willing to risk my life or my family's. I looked into the eyes of evil that day, and I'll never forget it. Faith, if you do hear this or read this, I love you, and always will. But your father's a monster. I suggest you get away from him as soon as possible. And until then, we'll be doomed to be apart. One heart, forever broken in two. I was around 15 when my dad got a job with the railroad. Now before then, he was an over-the-road truck driver. This job kept him away from home during the week, and Mom and I were lonely a lot, but the money was just too good to turn down. The two of us got used to dealing with things on our own. I learned to cook and do my own laundry during this time. This skill would serve me well later. Neither of my roommates in my first apartment had any clue how to do really anything, and it would be an eye-opening experience and made me appreciate my mom that much more. Maybe we can discuss that sometime later, though. Today, I want to tell everyone about something that happened to me during that time of learning. This was when I was about 12. I woke up for school as usual, but quickly realized that I was sick. Now, to keep this PG-rated, I had stuff spewing out of both ends, if you get my meaning. I tried to be an adult about it, but I fainted in front of my mom, and she put me to bed. Although not ideal, I was happy to have the day off from school. I was given a bunch of different medications and quickly passed out. I woke up once or twice to go to the bathroom, but I slept for most of the day otherwise. And just after 2 p.m., though, I awoke refreshed and feeling great. The sick feeling was completely gone, but now I was starving. My first instinct was to run into the kitchen and gorge myself. I decided that that was probably a bad idea. Instead, I took a page from my mom's book and tried some saltines. I'd had good luck with those in the past, and I also grabbed a Sprite while I was there and brought them back to my room. I was close to the bathroom if things went wrong. I had 9 or 10 crackers and half a glass of Sprite, and I waited 30 minutes to see if I'd barf them up. Nothing bad happened, but now I was even hungrier. I thought for a minute before choosing ramen as the safest option. I finished off the bottle of Sprite and made for the kitchen. My mom would be home soon, and under normal circumstances, I would have just waited for her to arrive, but I was so ravenous I couldn't wait any longer. I made ramen for myself several times. I filled the pot and eagerly watched in hopes that the water would boil quicker. It didn't. When the moment finally arrived, I broke up the noodles and added them to the water. A minute later, I poured the flavor packet in. I impatiently stirred until the noodles softened just enough to be edible. I was done waiting. Now, the events that followed were likely due to dehydration and overall weakness. I looked around for a pot holder but saw none. There was a hand towel nearby, though, so I grabbed for that. And the premise was the same. I couldn't see any problems. However, today was not a usual day. I lifted the pot and set it on the counter, like I normally do. As I set the towel aside, I realized that it was on fire. I snatched it back up and tossed it into the sink behind me. My hand was slightly burned in the process. The time I wasted worrying about my hand allowed the fire enough time to jump onto the curtains. From this point, I was always a step behind. The water from the faucet extinguished the flames quickly. My split second of satisfaction was destroyed once I noticed the burning curtains above the sink. Having one of those sprayers in my sink would have been perfect for this, but we didn't have one. I attempted to splash water from my hands. It was useless, though. The curtains were already consumed, and the fire had now taken hold on the ceiling and the adjoining cabinet. I was so overwhelmed and incapable of coming up with any remedy now. When the fire alarm went off, I gave up and ran out of the house. I opened the front door and ran directly into my mother. She was very calm, and all I could say It was fire. Kitchen. She didn't miss a step after that. To my amazement, she entered the kitchen and opened the door under the sink. Flames were covering the ceiling now. A few came unnervingly close to her, and like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, she withdrew a massive fire extinguisher from under the sink and pointed it at the ceiling. And within seconds, most of the flames on the ceiling were gone. From there, she backtracked to the cabinet and put the flames there out. If I had to guess, I'd say she had the fire completely extinguished in less than 30 seconds. It remains the single most amazing thing I've seen to this day. Mom ran over to check on me. It took a few seconds for me to regain my senses, but once I did, I broke down and cried. I was so relieved I couldn't speak. My mom got out the first aid kit and put some cream on my hands, and the weight of my actions began to dawn on me. I started apologizing over and over, and this made me cry again. Mom calmed me down and assured me that it wasn't a big deal. I couldn't see how it wasn't, but I'd have to rely on her judgment. Some time passed and we discussed what had happened. I expected her to scream at me any second, but she never did. After the excitement had passed, we walked into the kitchen to get a look at the damage. I sheepishly asked her what was going to happen, and her answer caught me completely off guard. Don't worry about it. I only care that you're safe. I'll tell your dad it's my fault. He may grumble a little, but what's done is done. I could feel the weight lift off my shoulders in real time. Rather than cry, like I wanted to do, I grabbed my mother as tight as possible and held her for a long time. And that's basically how everything occurred that day. After our little family moment ended, Mom and I cleaned up as much as we could. There wasn't really a lot we could do at the time. Dad would have to replace the cabinet before the painting was done. I recall that he wasn't as upset as we had expected. He simply asked if Mom and I were okay and let out a big sigh. A few weeks later, he came home with the cabinet and some cans of paint, and by the following week, the kitchen was looking as good as new. I'm still amazed at how quickly things can go from life-threatening to no big deal. Life's just kind of funny like that.
I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. Before I continue with this next part, I want to go ahead and say that I deeply regret doing the things I did when I was younger, and I don't condone breaking the law or doing the kind of things that I did back then. But anyways, I used to break into people's houses or garages, and I would steal whatever I could find for food money, or really whatever I wanted to spend it on. I should also mention that I lived in a very bad part of Nashville, by the way, but I would stay with my grandparents who had custody of my older brother on the weekends. Well, this particular weekend when I was about 13, I was going through some people's backyards looking for unlocked cars or garages. Well, I happened to notice a back door was open, about 4 or 5 inches with no lights on anywhere downstairs. So being the 13-year-old kid that I was, I go into the house, and while tiptoeing through the house trying to steal stuff like TVs and game systems, as well as computers, I heard a high-pitched scream, but it was muffled, if you can understand what I'm saying. Well, that stopped me dead in my tracks and caused me to listen way more intently. After the muffled scream, I had heard a slap and what sounded like someone then telling them, "Don't bother screaming, because nobody can hear you screaming down here." So I slowly started walking towards the screams, and I found a door cracked open that led to the basement, and I could tell there was a light on in the basement. I end up laying on the floor and looking down the steps towards the center of the basement, and I see that a man and a woman are tied up to some chairs in the basement, and both are gagged. The difference was that the man had his head hanging limp, and he had blood all over his chest, and he didn't even look like he was breathing. When I saw this, I got really scared, and then I took off running, making all kinds of noise. I know that it was loud enough for the intruder downstairs to hear me and freak out and start running up after me, but I just ran as fast as possible out the front door. I didn't even bother unlocking the screen door. I just ran right through it and ran down to the corner house, who I knew the owner was a firefighter. I started beating on his door, screaming for help, that there's a man chasing me trying to kill me like he did the neighbor. Well, this really freaked out the homeowner, and it caused him to pull out a weapon on me first until he noticed the deranged man running behind me at full speed, who had a machete in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Without saying a word, the fireman opened fire and he shot the guy in his leg, which caused him to fall, and it also caused the kitchen knife to go right through his own neck. I believe that actually killed him on sight. I never heard him make any noises, but I was making enough for myself at the moment. The fireman called the police before heading towards the neighbor's house that the man came from, and he then found the wife barely clinging to her own life. But unfortunately, the husband was pronounced dead on the scene. What I heard around the neighborhood afterwards was that the husband had been in a car accident about 6 months before this, and the said crazy man's wife had apparently died in that car wreck. This caused the man to go crazy and start drinking and doing drugs until he just didn't care about living, and he just wanted everyone to suffer like he and his wife had. So he went to the man's house and he tortured him and his wife for hours until he passed out from the pain. The intruder slit the husband's throat, and before chasing me, he slit the wife's throat as well. But luckily, the paramedics were able to save her when they arrived. So yeah, kids, don't break into other people's homes. You just might stumble onto something that you can't get out of. I'm a 19-year-old female, but this happened when I was 14. My family went to my aunt and uncle's house for some reason. I didn't want to go, so my parents let me stay home by myself. They said they were only going to be gone for a few hours, but at about 10 p.m., my dad called me. "Hey Ashlyn, we're going to be staying the night at your aunt and uncle's place. I love you. Good night." I didn't even have time to say anything before he hung up on the phone. I got frustrated because I didn't feel comfortable staying home alone then. I started to boil some water and make some ramen. When I was about to put the ramen in the water, I had heard the doorbell ring. I went to go look out the window and the door, but no one was there. For some context, the window has one of those half-circle ones at the top of the door. Anyway, I went back to tending the ramen when the doorbell rang again. I went to look again, but there was still no one there. My ramen was now done by this point, and I went to go sit on the couch to eat it. Once I was done and about to put the bowl in the sink, I had heard one of the basement windows then break. It was one of those windows that were very small and close to the ground. I just ran to my room at that point and I locked the door. After like 10 minutes, I slowly opened the door and there was nothing there. I went over to the basement door, which was right down the hall. I gathered all the courage to open up the door. It was really so dark down there, so I'd flicked the light above the stairs on. But what I saw next was absolutely disturbing. On the bottom step, there was a man there. He looked to be homeless. He was extremely skinny, like he hadn't even eaten in weeks. He was also smiling from ear to ear, holding a knife to his side. I just slammed the door and ran back to my room. I had a bit of a problem here. I left my phone on the coffee table in the living room, so I couldn't call the police. I then heard the basement door open. I just dove under my bed as I heard his footsteps getting closer. I heard my doorknob start to jiggle and shake. Then, I heard a small maniacal laugh. I got out from under the bed and started to open the window, and he then started banging on the door. I got the window open and jumped out. I ran to my neighbor's house, and they let me in to call the police. They arrived in 5 minutes and searched the house, while another cop started talking to me about the incident. They eventually found the man, and they brought him out in cuffs. They told me they found him hiding in my closet. I was terrified at this. I went in to grab some essentials, and I asked them to take me to my aunt and uncle's house. They did, and once we got there, I then told my parents everything that happened. It made me so scared to think that he was waiting for me to come back. I developed severe paranoia, and I had to start going to therapy in 2019 for this. Luckily, I'm doing better now, and last I heard about the man, he was still locked up, probably for something else. I was told he's going to be sent to a mental facility on July 21st, 2022, and I really do hope that he gets the help he needs. This happened about 3 weeks ago. It was roughly about 3:30 in the morning, and I was watching some YouTube videos. I saw my dog's ears perk up, and he walked to the back door. I figured he needed to use the restroom, so I went to let him out. When I made it over to the door, I unlocked it, and I was about to open the door, when something then told me to click the light on first. When I did so, I then saw something quickly flash behind the side of my house. I felt uneasy, but I opened the door and let the dog out. He immediately bolted to the side that I saw the flash, and then disappeared into the dark. I then grabbed my dad's 12-gauge shotgun that we keep hidden by the back door for emergencies. I grabbed my spotlight and looked around, but I couldn't really see from the porch. I closed the door and I stepped off the porch, calling my dog's name. Eventually he came running back to me, and I took him back into the house. But when I reached the door, I saw that it was cracked open. This frightened me, mostly because I was alone for the weekend, and I know I closed the door. As I approached the back door, gun in hand, I saw a light moving around in my house. I put my dog on his chain, and then slowly moved into the house. When I got into the room where the light was coming from, which was my sister's room, I slowly and quietly nudged the door open with my barrel. And when I turned on the light, I saw a large man wielding one of my knives from my bedroom. I told the man to drop the knife and get the fuck out of my house before I shoot him. He promptly dropped my knife, and he then proceeded to jump out of my sister's window like this was some kind of action movie or something. I fired 3 shots into the air as he ran away. I don't know who this man was or what he had planned, but whoever he was, if he happens to return, the next time, there will not be a warning. Hi, my name is Andrews, and I live in southern India. This just happened to me a couple of nights ago, and it's still really fresh in my mind. It was 30 minutes past 11 p.m., I believe. I was lying in my bed listening to Southern Cannibal to go to sleep, since I have amnesia, and imagining stories by listening to them makes me sleep much faster. Suddenly, I saw a beam of torchlight entering through my window from the back of my bed. At first, I thought it was just the security guard who guards my little secluded village, but that beam of light was persistent. This went on for 3 more minutes or so, with every window passing a considerable amount of torchlight to see as well. After the final window in my house passed a light, it was, well, gone. I thought it was strange, but I kept listening to the stories. After a while, I had heard the sounds of footsteps approaching my door, since I was now in the hall trying to sleep on the couch. I paused the story, and I had then looked out through a large vertical window facing the outside of my house. I dropped my AirPods case in shock, as I then saw a man wearing a kerchief around his mouth trying to do something with the lock. I then heard the sound of my lock turning. Stupidly, I hid under my couch to call 100, which is the number to call the police in India. The man then entered my house and started looking around the house. The operator then said that it would take the police from the nearest police outpost at least 10 minutes minimum to arrive in my house. He went into my bedroom, taking all the money I had as a broke college student, as I later found out after the cops arrived. He went around looking in the kitchen, and he actually took a piece of cake from the fridge, which I bought for my birthday. After that, he just left. I didn't go out to check if he had gone yet, because I saw him holding some sort of weapon, which I believe was a pipe. After what felt like an hour, but only 5 minutes, the cops arrived. The policeman arrived and announced their presence. I yelled from behind the couch, telling them that I was the one who called them. I then came out and they questioned me. What they said next sent chills down my spine. An old man who lived a couple houses down from the neighborhood actually called the cops, saying the same thing as I did. There was one key difference between him and me though. He was dead and I was alive. He was apparently bludgeoned with the supposed pipe that the thief was holding, and there was blood everywhere. The thief must have inspected the windows to see if anyone was in my home, and I guess after checking it out, he thought that no one was home and broke in. Needless to say, I didn't get any sleep that night, and I also got nightmares for the next few days, thinking of what would have happened if I hadn't paid attention to the lights and I was still in my bed, or if I was listening to those stories with high volume. The police said they'd look into the case more and keep me updated. To this day, I've received no updates, and I'm still very afraid that that murderous psycho of a thief is still out there. I know everybody says this, and it's very cliche, but stay safe out there. Always lock your doors and windows. Back in September, I moved out of my parents' place and into my own new townhouse. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine, and it immediately started feeling like home. I live in a quiet neighborhood where basically there's no crime, and everyone keeps to themselves. At the time this story took place, I lived completely alone. I wasn't really sure what to make of it, and I still have more questions than answers. Everything was going really great in my new place for about a week. That was until one night, at about 3 a.m., I was home alone asleep, when I then awoke to the sound of my doorbell ringing. I thought for a moment that I might have just dreamed it, but my fears were confirmed when I then heard the doorbell chime once again. Surely no one ringing my doorbell at 3 a.m. had good intentions. My bedroom is on the second floor and looked straight down to the front steps. I sat, trying to will up enough courage to look outside. I eventually felt confident enough to look, but to my surprise, there was no one there. I honestly wasn't sure whether this made things better or if it just made the whole thing even more unnerving. I eventually calmed down and then slept for the rest of the night. I later on checked outside in the morning, but I didn't see anything. I went on with my day and just forgot about the whole thing. Fast forward a few weeks, and the same thing happens again. Once again at around 3 a.m. A feeling of dread filled my body as I sat bolt upright in bed. I could feel my own heart beating in my throat. I cautiously peered through my curtains, and again, no one was there. This was just not making any sense. My doorbell never rang on its own during the day, and it was way too high for any animal to reach it. This occurred several more times in the coming weeks. It was always in the middle of the night around 3 a.m., as though it were planned. One day though, it just stopped altogether, and it hasn't happened again. I am relieved that this eerie and unnerving incident no longer occurs, but I still often wonder why this happened. Had it not always happened around the same time, it might have had a better explanation, but I have no good reason for why this happened. This has since stopped though, and I'm thankful. I'll be sure to provide an update if anything starts to happen again.